Good evening, friends. Tonight we slip behind the velvet curtains of medieval palaces to meet the queens who made popes blush and chroniclers reach for their strongest ink. We'll wander through silk-draped chambers where love letters were sewn into hems, where poison was served with a smile at banquets, and where queens balanced morning prayers with midnight conspiracies that would reshape entire kingdoms. If these gentle tales of royal scandal help you drift away, consider tapping like and subscribe, and in the comments, do share where you're listening from and what hour your clock shows. It's quite wonderful how our drowsy community spans from castle ruins to modern apartments. So lower your lights, perhaps let a soft breeze flow through your window, nestle into your covers, and let's journey back to an age when wearing a crown meant playing a rather deadly game of appearances, where being called perverted by medieval standards often just meant you had the audacity to think for yourself. Imagine yourself awakening in a medieval queen's chamber, not as the queen herself, but as an invisible observer, floating through stone corridors where every shadow might conceal a secret. The morning light filters weakly through narrow windows, casting long fingers across floors of cold stone partially covered by rushes and imported carpets. The air carries a complex bouquet of scents, burning wax from countless candles, the lingering sweetness of rose water, and underneath it all, the perpetual dampness that no amount of tapestry could ever quite banish from these ancient walls. The queen's day begins before dawn, though not by her choice. Her ladies-in-waiting have been stirring since the bells of matins rang out across the castle grounds. They move through her chambers with practiced silence, preparing everything for the moment their mistress opens her eyes. The fireplace has been carefully tended through the night, ensuring the room maintains what passes for warmth in this age of stone and draught. Though honestly, warmth is a rather generous term for what amounts to slightly less freezing than the corridors outside. As our queen stirs beneath layers of fur and wool, yes, even royalty needed multiple blankets to survive medieval mornings, her first conscious thought might not be of kingdom or crown, but rather of the small leather pouch hidden beneath her pillow. Inside, a letter written in a cipher known only to 2 souls in all of Christendom. The parchment still carries the faint scent of the messenger who delivered it 3 nights ago, slipping through a passage behind the garderobe that officially doesn't exist. These hidden passages were architectural necessities that became political tools. Built originally for servants to move unseen, carrying chamber pots and fresh linens, they evolved into highways for secrets. Every castle worth its stone had them, winding through walls thick enough to muffle footsteps and whispered conversations. The queen knows each turn, each loose stone that might betray a careless step. She's walked them herself on nights when the moon was new and darkness absolute. Her ladies begin the elaborate process of dressing their mistress. First, the chemise of finest linen, so thin it's nearly transparent, a luxury that cost more than a village might see in a year. Then the layers begin, each one a statement of wealth, power, and paradoxically, vulnerability. For you see, a queen who cannot dress herself is a queen who must trust completely those closest to her. And trust, in these chambers, is a currency more precious than gold. Lady Margaret, her most senior attendant, has served 3 queens before this one. Her fingers, now gnarled with age, still move with surprising grace as they work the laces. She knows precisely how tight to pull, enough to create the silhouette fashion demands, not so tight that her mistress might faint during the lengthy morning mass. Margaret has seen queens come and go, some to childbirth, some to poison, one to a rather unfortunate tumble downstairs that everyone agreed was definitely an accident. As the dress is secured, today a deep burgundy silk that arrived last month from Byzantium, the queen's fingers absently trace patterns on her sleeves. To any observer, she appears lost in thought. perhaps contemplating prayers or matters of state. In reality, she's reviewing the coded message she'll have embroidered into the hem of an altar cloth she's devotedly creating for the cathedral. Each stitch will carry meaning: a rose for danger, a lily for safety, a peculiar knot that means wait for my signal. The art of needlework, you see, was one of the few activities considered absolutely appropriate for noble women. Hours upon hours spent with needle and thread, creating beautiful tapestries and religious items. How wonderfully convenient that no man would think to closely examine women's work for anything beyond its aesthetic value. The Queen's current project, a magnificent piece depicting the Virgin Mary surrounded by angels, contains within its holy threads a complete report on troop movements along the northern border. But before she can return to her needlework, there's the matter of breaking her fast. The great hall awaits, and with it, the delicate dance of a public meal. Every bite watched, every sip analyzed. Did she eat too much? Clearly a glutton. Too little? Obviously ill, or perhaps with child, or worst of all, fasting in penance for some unknown sin that the court gossips will inevitably invent. The Queen descends the stone stairs, her silk gown whispering against each step. Her ladies follow in careful formation, a flowing river of fabric and feminine power that men pretend not to fear. In the great hall the Lord's table has been prepared. White bread, a luxury that announces status with every crumb. Watered wine in goblets of silver, tested first by her cupbearer, a young man whose primary qualification is his apparently robust constitution and his mother's political connections. The art of poisoning, despite what troubadours might sing, was rarely dramatic. No one keeled over immediately after sipping wine, clutching their throat in theatrical agony. Real poison was patient. It accumulated slowly in the body over weeks or months. A little antimony in the morning ale, a touch of mercury in the evening's meat, symptoms that looked remarkably like any number of common ailments that plagued medieval life. Our Queen knows this dance well. She's survived 2 attempts already, though only she and her personal physician, a Jewish doctor she keeps hidden in the castle despite the Church's stern disapproval, know the truth. The first attempt left her weakened for months, attributed publicly to women's troubles. The second, more creative, involved powdered glass so fine it was nearly invisible, mixed into her face powder. Fortunately, her unauthorized physician recognized the symptoms before permanent damage was done. This is why she maintains her own kitchen within her chambers, a small room where trusted servants prepare certain meals under her direct supervision. The official story is that she has a delicate constitution requiring special foods. The truth is far more practical. Survival often depends on controlling what enters one's body. After the morning meal, she retreats to her solar. This private chamber, high in the castle's eastern tower, serves as her sanctuary. Here, surrounded by her most trusted ladies, she can almost relax. Almost. For even here, ears might be listening. The Church has made an art of placing confessors who report to bishops who report to Rome. And Rome, as everyone knows, has opinions about everything. Speaking of confessors, Father Benedict arrives for her weekly confession, though weekly has become somewhat flexible. The Queen has developed a recurring illness that strikes precisely when certain sins might need discussing. Today, however, she cannot avoid him. He settles his considerable bulk onto a cushioned stool, his pink face already glistening with the effort of climbing the tower stairs. "My child," he begins, his voice unctuous as oil, "I trust you have examined your conscience fully." The Queen kneels on the hard wooden prie-dieu, designed specifically to be uncomfortable. Comfort, after all, might distract from proper penitence. She begins her litany of minor sins: pride in her appearance, moments of anger toward servants, failure to show proper gratitude for God's blessings. She carefully avoids mentioning the young knight who spent 3 hours in her chambers last Tuesday discussing poetry. They were definitely discussing poetry. Father Benedict listens with the patience of a spider in its web. He knows there's more. There always is with queens. But he also knows the delicate balance he must maintain. Push too hard, and she might request a different confessor. Push too little, and his superiors might question his effectiveness. The queen, for her part, gives him just enough scandal to report, a few venial sins, some minor gossip, keeping him satisfied while her real secrets remain buried deeper than any crypt. After confession comes the midday meal, another performance of public consumption. The queen sits at the high table, visible to all, eating with the precise movements expected of her station. Between courses, she engages in the art of conversation, light enough to seem innocent, layered enough that those who know how to listen hear different messages entirely. Lord Edmund, her husband's cousin, mentions the wonderful hunting in the northern forests. To most, it's idle chatter. To the queen, it's confirmation that his men are positioned where her informants reported. She responds with enthusiasm about the embroidered hunting scene she's working on, particularly the detailed wolves. Edmund's eye twitches almost imperceptibly. He understands. She knows about his meeting with the rival faction. This is the exhausting reality of a medieval queen's existence. Every word carries weight, every gesture has meaning. Even her choice of jewelry sends messages. Today's ruby brooch, a gift from her late mother-in-law, suggests loyalty to her husband's family. But those who look closely might notice it's pinned slightly off-center, a subtle sign of discord that her allies will recognize. After the meal, she returns to her chambers for the afternoon's rest. This is perhaps the most dangerous time of her day. Officially, she's retiring for prayer and contemplation. Unofficially, this is when real business gets conducted. Letters are written in invisible ink made from lemon juice and wine. Documents are hidden in false bottoms of jewelry boxes, and sometimes, very carefully, certain visitors arrive. The passage behind the garderobe opens silently. Well-oiled hinges don't betray movement. A figure slips in, hooded and cloaked. It could be anyone, a spy, a lover, an assassin, or simply her personal merchant bringing items the church would frown upon. Today, it's her cousin from a neighboring kingdom, bringing news that can't travel through official channels. They speak in whispers, standing close enough that their words won't carry. He tells her of movements in Rome, of a papal bull being prepared that would affect the succession. She shares intelligence about her husband's failing health, information not even the king's physicians possess. They trade secrets like merchants trade spices, each piece carefully weighed and valued. The conversation is brief, no more than a quarter hour, long enough to exchange essential information, not so long that absence might be noticed. Before he leaves, he hands her a small vial. "From your friend in Venice," he says simply. She doesn't ask what it contains. She doesn't need to. Some knowledge is safer unspoken. As afternoon fades to evening, the queen must prepare for the most public performance of her day. Vespers, followed by the evening feast. Her ladies dress her again, this time in cloth of gold that catches every candle flame. The dress is magnificent and monumentally uncomfortable. The gold thread is actually wrapped around silk cores, making the fabric stiff as armor and nearly as heavy. But beauty, as they say, requires sacrifice. Though one might reasonably ask whose beauty and whose sacrifice. She processes to the chapel with measured steps. The stone floors echo with the footfalls of her entourage. The chapel is already full. Attendance at evening prayers is less about devotion and more about being seen to be devout. The Queen takes her place in the royal gallery, elevated above the common worshippers but below the altar. Even architecture reinforces hierarchy. During the service, she appears absorbed in prayer. Her lips move in perfect synchronization with the Latin phrases she's known since childhood. But her mind is elsewhere, calculating. The bishop's new secretary keeps glancing her way. Is it merely appreciation for her beauty, or has he been tasked with observation? The Countess of Westford is wearing her mourning veil again, despite her husband dying 2 years ago. Is she genuinely grieving, or is black simply convenient for moving through shadows? The priest drones on about the virtue of obedience, particularly feminine obedience. The Queen's face remains serene, even as she mentally composes a rather different sermon. One about Judith, who saved her people by separating a tyrant's head from his shoulders, or perhaps Esther, who used her position to orchestrate the downfall of her enemies. Biblical women, she's noticed, were considerably more interesting than priests would have you believe. After Vespers comes the evening feast, the day's grand finale of political theater. The great hall blazes with the light of 100 candles, their smoke mixing with that from the massive fireplaces to create a haze that makes everything seem slightly dreamlike. Or perhaps that's the wine. One can never be entirely certain. The Queen takes her seat as music begins. The musicians, positioned in the gallery above, play the expected courtly tunes. But tonight, woven into the familiar melodies, is a particular sequence of notes that only 3 people in the hall recognize. It's a signal that the package she's been expecting has arrived safely. The food arrives in waves. First the appetizers, small birds roasted whole, their beaks gilded for presentation. Then soups, thick with exotic spices that cost more per ounce than gold. The main courses follow, roasted meats swimming in sauces designed to display wealth as much as enhance flavor. Each dish is first presented to the Queen, who takes a ceremonial bite before it's served to others. She eats sparingly, partly from caution, partly because the corset beneath her gown leaves little room for food. But she appears to enjoy every morsel, complimenting the cooks, praising the presentation, all while noting that Lord Blackwood's food taster seems unusually pale, and that the Duke of Ruthingham has declined the fish course despite it being his known favorite. Between courses, there's entertainment. Jugglers and acrobats perform impossible feats. A troubadour sings of courtly love, his verses dancing dangerously close to sedition if one knows how to interpret metaphor. The Queen applauds at all the right moments, even tossing a gold coin to a particularly clever fool who manages to mock 3 different courtiers while appearing to tell an innocent story about a farmer and his donkey. As the evening progresses, wine flows more freely. Tongues loosen, guards drop, and the Queen watches everything. She notes who speaks to whom, who avoids whom, who drinks too much, who pretends to drink while staying sharp. Information is gathered like a harvest, stored away for future use. Lord Pemberton, deep in his cups, lets slip that his son has been recalled from the university. Interesting, considering he'd boasted just last week about the boy's scholarly achievements. The Duchess of Moorfield keeps touching her stomach and declining wine. Either she's with child or wants people to think she is. Either way, it's useful intelligence. Finally, mercifully, the feast winds down. The queen rises, signaling that she's retiring. The hall stands as she processes out, her ladies falling in behind her like a golden wake. But the day isn't over. Not nearly. Back in her chambers, the real work begins. The public queen is carefully dismantled, the golden gown removed and stored, the jewels locked away, the pins pulled from her elaborate hairstyle, letting it fall in waves down her back. With each layer removed, she becomes more herself and paradoxically more vulnerable. Now, in just her shift and a warm robe, she can attend to the correspondence that truly matters. Her ladies-in-waiting, the trusted ones, not the spies she knows are among them, help encode messages. One writes while the queen dictates, using a cipher that changes every moon. Another prepares the sealing wax, mixing in a special ingredient that will reveal if the letter is opened before reaching its destination. These letters will leave the castle by various means, some hidden in merchants' wagons, others carried by travelers who don't know what they transport. A few will go by carrier pigeon, though those must be especially brief and coded beyond recognition. The queen maintains a network that spans from Scotland to Sicily, from Irish monasteries to Byzantine palaces. Tonight's letters are particularly crucial. One goes to her sister, warning of a marriage alliance that would threaten their family's position. Another to a banker in Florence, authorizing funds for purposes left deliberately vague. A third to an abbess who runs more than just a convent. She's the center of an intelligence network that rivals any kingdom's. As midnight approaches, there's one final ritual. The queen dismisses all but her most trusted lady. Together, they check the chamber for signs of intrusion. A thread placed across a doorway. Powder sprinkled on the floor that would show footprints. Small things that might save a life. Finally, truly alone, the queen allows herself a moment of genuine emotion. The mask she wears every waking moment slips just slightly. In the dancing shadows cast by the dying fire, you might glimpse exhaustion, fear, loneliness, the weight of secrets, the burden of constant performance, the isolation of never truly trusting anyone completely. She opens a hidden compartment in her writing desk, one even her ladies don't know about. Inside are her most precious secrets. Letters from a lover dead these 5 years. A lock of hair from the child she lost before anyone knew she was with child. A vial of poison, her last resort if circumstances become unbearable. And a small portrait painted in miniature of the person she might have been in a different life. But sentiment is a luxury she can't afford for long. She closes the compartment, checks once more that her door is barred, and prepares for bed. Even sleep offers no true respite. She's trained herself to wake at the slightest sound, to sleep with one hand on the dagger beneath her pillow. As she lies in the darkness, she reviews the day. Every conversation analyzed, every gesture catalogued, every piece of information filed away. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities. The game never ends. In the distance, she can hear the castle settling for the night. Guards changing shifts. Servants finishing their final tasks. Somewhere, a baby cries, perhaps the baker's new son, or maybe the ghost that supposedly haunts the North Tower. In this age, both explanations are equally plausible. Her breathing slows, but her mind continues its relentless calculations. The bishop's secretary, definitely a spy, but whose? The countess's extended mourning, genuine grief or cover for an affair. Lord Pemberton's son, recalled for academic failure or political intrigue. Each question branches into possibilities, strategies, contingencies. This is the reality of a medieval queen's forbidden day. Not a single moment of genuine freedom. Every action watched, every word weighed, every thought potentially treasonous. She exists in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury that could turn lethal at any moment. The silk that adorns her body might hide a poisoned needle. The wine that graces her table might carry her death. The confessor who absolves her sins might be documenting her destruction. Even love, if she dares pursue it, could lead to her downfall. Yet within these constraints she wields enormous power. Through her network of informants and allies, she influences events across kingdoms. Through her needlework and correspondence, she conducts diplomacy that shapes nations. Through her carefully managed reputation, she protects or destroys careers with a whispered word. The coded messages in her embroidery have prevented wars and started others. The secrets she's gathered have toppled dynasties and elevated obscure families to prominence. The poisons she's survived have made her virtually immune to common toxins, an advantage she's used more than once. Her ladies-in-waiting form their own complex ecosystem within these chambers, each one selected for specific reasons that have little to do with their ability to style hair or mend clothing. Lady Catherine, for instance, comes from a family with extensive trade connections. Her brothers control shipping routes that the Queen needs to remain open. Lady Isabel's uncle sits on the King's Council, making her a valuable source of information about her husband's plans. And young Lady Anne, barely 16, is here precisely because her innocence is genuine, a rare quality that makes her perfect for delivering messages no one would suspect her of carrying. These women exist in their own precarious balance, loyal to the Queen, but aware that such loyalty might cost them everything. They've seen what happens to those who choose the wrong side in palace intrigue. Just last winter, the Duchess of Thornbury's entire household was dismissed, officially for theft, unofficially for supporting the wrong faction in a succession dispute. The Duchess herself retired to a convent, though whether by choice or coercion remains a topic of whispered speculation. The Queen knows she asks much of these women. They sacrifice their own prospects for marriage, tying their fates to hers. Some will never wed, growing old in her service. Others will accept arranged marriages that serve the Queen's political needs rather than their own hearts. It's a cold calculation, but sentiment has no place in survival. As she drifts toward sleep, the Queen's thoughts turn to tomorrow's challenges. The ambassador from France arrives at noon, bringing proposals she already knows she'll reject. But the dance must be performed, the negotiations conducted with proper ceremony. She'll wear her blue silk, the one that brings out her eyes. Assets are assets, after all, whether political or physical. There's also the matter of her husband's increasing paranoia. He's begun posting guards outside her chambers, claiming it's for her protection. She knows better. They're not there to keep dangers out, but to keep her in. He suspects something, though hopefully not the full truth. The complete truth would mean her head on a spike above the castle gates. The art of managing a suspicious husband while conducting treasonous correspondence requires a delicate touch. Too much affection, and he'll know she's hiding something. Too little, and he'll assume she's plotting. She must be precisely as loving as a dutiful wife should be. No more, no less. It's exhausting, this constant calibration of emotions. Sometimes she wonders what would happen if she simply stopped. If she refused to play the game, spoke her mind freely, acted on her desires without calculation. The thought is simultaneously terrifying and oddly liberating. But she knows the answer. History is littered with the bodies of queens who forgot the rules. Queen Brunhilde, dragged to death behind a wild horse for her crimes against propriety, and of Kiev, whose intelligence and education made her too dangerous to live. Fredegund, who survived only by becoming more ruthless than her enemies. Each one a cautionary tale whispered in the nurseries of noble girls. Be clever, but not too clever. Be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Be powerful, but never appear to be. The candle beside her bed gutters, casting wild shadows on the tapestried walls. In the dancing light, the woven figures seem to move. Knights riding to battle, ladies dancing, dragons devouring the unwary. Perhaps it's her tired eyes, or perhaps it's the small dose of poppy syrup she takes to ensure sleep. Just enough to quiet the mind, not enough to dull tomorrow's sharp edges. Outside her window an owl calls once, twice, 3 times. A natural sound that could mean nothing, or could be the signal that her message has been received. She'll know for certain tomorrow when she checks the loose stone in the garden wall. These small uncertainties accumulate like debts, each one adding weight to her carefully maintained composure. In her dreams, when they finally come, she's sometimes free, running through meadows without guards trailing behind, speaking words that aren't coded, loving without consequence. But even her dreams aren't entirely safe. She's trained herself not to talk in her sleep, not to cry out, because even unconscious revelations can be dangerous when the wrong ears are listening. The life of a medieval queen, you see, is one of constant performance. From the moment she wakes until long after she sleeps, she plays a role written by others but directed by herself. Every gesture calculated, every word weighed, every emotion filtered through the lens of survival. And so our queen's forbidden day draws to a close. Though close is perhaps the wrong word. These days don't really end. They bleed into one another, an endless cycle of conspiracy and careful steps. Tomorrow she'll wake and do it all again. The dressing, the prayers, the meals, the coded conversations, the secret letters, the constant vigilance. This is what it means to be a queen in an age when power was measured in secrets and survival was an art form. Behind the silk and gold, beyond the prayers and pageantry, exists a world of shadows where information is currency and trust is a luxury none can afford. As you drift off yourself, perhaps in your comfortable bed with its modern securities, consider the exhausting reality of our medieval queen. Every comfort came with a cost. Every privilege carried a price. And every single day was a delicate dance between power and peril, where one false step could mean not just social embarrassment but actual, literal death. The silk chambers and secret letters weren't romantic adventures. They were survival tools in a world where being female and powerful was itself a form of perversion in the eyes of those who wrote the rules. And yet, these queens persisted. They schemed and survived, loved and lost, and sometimes, against all odds, they even won. And now, as we leave the shadowed chambers of our unnamed queen, we turn to perhaps the most fascinating woman to ever wear a crown in medieval Europe. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them entirely, then dared anyone to say something about it. Picture, if you will, the year 1122. In the Duchy of Aquitaine, the wealthiest and most cultured region of what would become France, a child is born who will outlive 2 husbands, multiple rebellions, and the expectations of an entire continent. Eleanor entered the world with advantages most could only dream of: wealth that surpassed kings, lands that stretched from the Loire to the Pyrenees, and perhaps most dangerously, an education. Her grandfather, William IX, was known as the first troubadour. a warrior poet who wrote scandalous verses about love and desire when he wasn't busy excommunicating himself through various adventures. He filled his granddaughter's childhood with music, poetry, and the radical notion that perhaps women were capable of independent thought. Imagine that. By the age of 15, Eleanor had already buried her father and brother, making her the most eligible heiress in Christendom. She controlled more land than the King of France himself, which naturally made her irresistible to, well, the King of France himself. Louis VI, known optimistically as Louis the Fat, quickly arranged for his son to marry this golden goose, though calling Eleanor a goose seems rather inadequate. She was more of a swan, beautiful, graceful, and capable of breaking your arm if you got too close. Young Louis VII was everything Eleanor was not. Pious where she was worldly, timid where she was bold, fascinated by theology where she preferred poetry. Their wedding in 1137 was magnificent, as royal weddings tend to be when you're trying to distract from fundamental incompatibility. Within weeks of their marriage, Louis VI died, possibly from the shock of seeing his son actually married, and suddenly Eleanor wasn't just a duchess, she was Queen of France. The French court had never seen anything quite like her. Eleanor arrived in Paris with her troubadours, her southern fashions, and her decidedly relaxed attitude toward the strict religious protocols that Louis held so dear. She introduced the concept of courtly love to the stern northern nobles, the idea that perhaps marriage and romance didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Revolutionary, really. The Parisian courtiers were scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. Here was a queen who didn't just sit quietly during councils but actually offered opinions. Educated opinions, no less. She could read and write in multiple languages, understood law and economics, and worst of all, she let it show. The chroniclers of the time didn't quite know what to do with her. Their accounts swing wildly between admiration and horror, often in the same paragraph. Louis, meanwhile, was having something of a spiritual crisis. He'd been intended for the church before his older brother inconveniently died, and he never quite shook off his monastic inclinations. He wore hair shirts under his royal robes, fasted with enthusiasm that worried his physicians, and approached the marriage bed with all the passion of someone attending a particularly tedious prayer service. Eleanor, who had grown up in a court where love was celebrated in song and story, found herself married to a man who considered smiling during Lent to be borderline heretical. The marriage produced 2 daughters, which in medieval terms meant it produced nothing at all. Daughters were lovely, of course, but they couldn't inherit the French throne. Each girl's birth was met with polite disappointment and increasing pressure. Eleanor was failing at a queen's primary duty, providing male heirs, though one might reasonably point out that the determination of a child's sex was rather beyond her control. Biology, however, has never been particularly relevant to blame. Then came the Second Crusade, that glorious disaster that would change everything. In 1147, the call went out to reclaim Edessa from the Muslims. Louis, seeing an opportunity to atone for some unfortunate incidents involving burned churches and dead civilians, immediately signed up. Eleanor, in a move that shocked absolutely everyone, announced she was going too. The idea of a queen on crusade was unprecedented. Women simply didn't do such things. They stayed home, managed estates, and worried about their crusading husbands. Eleanor packed her bags anyway. She also packed 300 of her ladies-in-waiting, creating what must have been the most elaborately dressed military campaign in history. The journey to the Holy Land was a comedy of errors that would have been amusing if it hadn't killed so many people. Eleanor and her ladies, dressed in armor fashioned more for appearance than protection, rode white horses and carried banners embroidered with gold. They looked magnificent. They were also completely useless in actual combat, though the chronicles suggest their presence did wonders for morale, or perhaps distraction. It was in Antioch that everything began to unravel, or perhaps finally came together, depending on your perspective. The city was ruled by Eleanor's uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, a man only 8 years her senior, handsome, cultured, and everything Louis was not. The two spent long hours in private conversation, discussing strategy, or so they claimed. Louis grew increasingly suspicious, particularly when Eleanor suggested military plans that actually made sense while his own strategies led to embarrassing defeats. The relationship between Eleanor and Raymond became the scandal of the crusade, which is saying something, considering the crusade itself was essentially a parade of scandals held together by religious fervor and questionable logistics. Were they lovers? The chroniclers certainly wanted them to be. The truth, as always with Eleanor, remains deliciously ambiguous. What we do know is that when Louis demanded they leave Antioch immediately, Eleanor made an announcement that shook the medieval world. She wanted a divorce. In 1149, the word divorce was about as common in royal vocabulary as gender equality or religious tolerance. Queens didn't divorce kings. They suffered in silence, died in childbirth, or occasionally fell down convenient staircases. They certainly didn't stand in foreign cities, surrounded by Saracens and Crusaders, and announce that their marriage was invalid. Eleanor's argument was brilliantly legal. She and Louis were related within the fourth degree, fourth cousins to be precise. The Church forbade such unions. Conveniently, this technicality hadn't mattered when uniting the wealth of Aquitaine with the French crown, but now it was insurmountable. The fact that Eleanor had discovered this impediment only after 15 years of marriage and a failed crusade was surely coincidental. Louis, devastated and humiliated, tried everything to change her mind. He locked her in her chambers. He appealed to the Pope. He even, in a moment of desperate passion that must have surprised them both, attempted to rekindle their romantic connection. The result was another daughter. Even their reconciliation was disappointing. The journey back to France was tense. They traveled separately, which, given the dangers of medieval travel, speaks volumes about their mutual antipathy. Pirates, storms, and hostile territories were apparently preferable to each other's company. Eleanor's ship was actually attacked by Byzantine forces. She escaped, adding survived naval combat to her already impressive resume. Back in Paris, the marriage limped along for 2 more years. 2 years of frigid politeness and careful avoidance. The court watched this slow-motion disaster with the fascination usually reserved for public executions. Finally, in March 1152, the marriage was annulled. Eleanor walked away with her lands intact, her reputation in tatters, and her freedom restored. What happened next shocked everyone and confirmed every suspicion about Eleanor's dangerous independence. Within 8 weeks of her annulment, she married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and soon-to-be King of England. The speed was scandalous. The choice was brilliant. Henry was everything Louis wasn't. 18 years younger than Eleanor. Yes, you heard that correctly. He was energetic, ambitious, intelligent, and passionate about more than just prayers. He was also her third cousin, but apparently consanguinity was only a problem when you wanted it to be. Their marriage was clearly planned before her annulment was final, a detail that sent Louis into fits of rage that chroniclers described with barely concealed glee. Consider the audacity. Eleanor had just divorced the King of France, and before the ink was dry on the annulment papers, metaphorically speaking, since these things were sealed in wax, she married his greatest rival. Henry controlled Normandy and Anjou. Eleanor brought Aquitaine. Together, they controlled more of France than the French king himself. It was a masterpiece of political maneuvering dressed up as a romance. Their wedding night, according to the few accounts that dare to speculate, was somewhat different from her first. Henry, unlike Louis, had no monastic inclinations. He approached marriage with the enthusiasm he brought to everything else, excessive, overwhelming, and occasionally exhausting. Eleanor, finally paired with someone who matched her energy, began producing heirs with impressive efficiency. Within 15 years, she gave Henry 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, including Richard, who would be called Lionheart, and John, who would be called rather less flattering things. She managed this while also ruling her own lands, governing England when Henry was away, which was often, and maintaining a court that became the envy of Europe. The court at Poitiers, Eleanor's favorite residence, became a center of culture that rivaled Paris and Rome. Troubadours flocked there, bringing songs of courtly love that placed women at the center of romantic narrative. The very concept of chivalry, of knights serving ladies with devotion and respect, flourished under her patronage. It was a radical reimagining of gender relations, even if it was mostly theoretical. She established the courts of love, where matters of romance were debated with the seriousness usually reserved for theology. Questions like, can true love exist in marriage? Were examined by panels of noble ladies. The answer, incidentally, was usually no. Marriage was for politics and property. Love was something altogether different. Eleanor had learned that lesson well. But even this second marriage, begun with such passion and strategic brilliance, would eventually sour. Henry, it turned out, had inherited the Plantagenet temper along with the Plantagenet territories. His rages were legendary. He once rolled on the floor, chewing rushes like a madman when thwarted. He also had a wandering eye that settled on increasingly younger women as Eleanor aged. The most painful betrayal came in the form of Rosamund Clifford, Fair Rosamund, as the poets called her. Henry's affair with her was conducted with unusual openness, even for an age when royal mistresses were common. He built her a bower at Woodstock, visiting her while Eleanor was pregnant with their last child. The humiliation was public and calculated. Eleanor's response was not to weep or rage or retreat to a convent as a proper queen should. Instead, she began to plan. If Henry thought she would quietly accept his infidelities while managing his kingdom, he had forgotten who he married. This wasn't Louis, intimidated by her intelligence. This was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she had survived too much to be discarded like an unfashionable gown. She began by cultivating her sons, particularly Richard, her favorite, and Geoffrey, the clever one. She filled their heads with stories of their inheritance, their rights, their father's injustices. She created a generation of princes who looked to her, not Henry, for guidance. It was patient work, requiring years of careful manipulation. But Eleanor had always played the long game. The court of Poitiers became more than a cultural center. It became an alternative power base. While Henry rampaged through his territories, fighting wars and bedding mistresses, Eleanor quietly built alliances. She corresponded with kings and popes, with merchants and scholars. Her network, established during her years as Queen of France and expanded as Queen of England, stretched across the known world. The troubadours at her court sang songs that were supposedly about ancient heroes and mythical ladies, but everyone understood the subtext. The cruel king who betrayed his noble queen. The brave sons who defended their mother's honor. The stories spread from castle to castle, creating a narrative that Henry couldn't combat with swords or laws. By 1173, Eleanor was ready. At the age of 51, when most noble women were settling into dignified dowagerhood, she launched a rebellion against her husband. Not directly, that would have been crude. Instead, she encouraged her sons to demand their inheritance early, to claim the lands Henry had promised but never delivered. Young Henry, the heir, rose first. Then Richard in Aquitaine, Geoffrey in Brittany. Even John, barely 7, was supposedly part of the plot, though his contribution was likely limited to looking adorable while treason was discussed. Eleanor coordinated it all from Poitiers, the spider at the center of an increasingly tangled web. The Great Rebellion, as historians dramatically call it, was initially successful. Henry found himself fighting on multiple fronts, his own sons supported by the King of France, Louis, of all people, finally getting some revenge for that hasty remarriage. Eleanor's strategy was brilliant. By dividing Henry's attention and resources, she made him vulnerable in a way he'd never been before. But Henry hadn't become one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe by being easily defeated. He moved with characteristic speed and brutality. One by one, he cornered his rebellious sons, offering them generous terms if they abandoned their mother's cause. Young men, it turns out, are often more interested in immediate power than maternal loyalty. Eleanor, seeing the tide turning, attempted to escape to Paris. She dressed as a man, another shocking breach of protocol, and rode hard for the French border. But Henry's agents were everywhere. She was captured just miles from safety, supposedly recognized by her excellent horsemanship, which no amount of male clothing could disguise. What followed was not the quick execution that many expected. Henry, despite his rage, couldn't quite bring himself to kill Eleanor. Perhaps it was residual affection. Perhaps it was fear of her son's reaction. Or perhaps he understood that martyrdom would make her more powerful than imprisonment ever could. Instead, she was confined. For the next 16 years, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had crossed deserts on crusade and ruled 2 kingdoms, was held in various English castles. Not quite a prisoner, she was allowed certain comforts and occasional supervised visits, but certainly not free. It was a gilded cage for a woman who had never accepted any cage at all. During those long years of confinement, Eleanor watched from afar as her family tore itself apart. Young Henry died of dysentery while fighting his father. Geoffrey was trampled at a tournament. Henry took new mistresses, each younger than the last. And still she waited, patient as stone, knowing that time was her ally now. She spent her imprisonment reading, writing, and most importantly, maintaining her networks. Letters flowed in and out of her prison, supposedly innocent correspondence about household matters and religious devotions. In reality, she was keeping her finger on the pulse of European politics, waiting for her moment. That moment came in 1189 when Henry, worn down by years of conflict and betrayal, finally died. He'd been defeated in battle by Richard, allied with Philip Augustus of France. His last words were supposedly about the treachery of his sons. But Eleanor knew better. This was her victory, delayed but not denied. Richard, now King Richard I, immediately freed his mother. At 67 years old, an age when most medieval women were either dead or forgotten, Eleanor emerged from her imprisonment more powerful than ever. She'd outlasted her husband, outlived most of her enemies, and now her favorite son sat on the throne of England. The chronicles describe her release with awe. She didn't creep out broken and aged. She swept out with all the dignity of a queen who had simply been temporarily inconvenienced. Her first act of freedom was to tour England, her son's kingdom that she'd helped govern years before. But this wasn't a sentimental journey. Eleanor was establishing Richard's authority, using her still considerable influence to secure loyalty from nobles who might have other ideas. At every stop, she held court, dispensing justice and pardons with the authority Richard had granted her. The woman who'd been locked away for 16 years was now effectively ruling England. Richard, you see, had inherited his father's territories, but not his father's interest in actually governing them. He was a warrior, a crusader, a figure of romance. Administrative work bored him senseless. Eleanor, who had been managing kingdoms since before Richard was born, smoothly took control. The arrangement suited them both perfectly. Within a year of his coronation, Richard was gone, off to the Third Crusade, chasing glory in the Holy Land just as his parents had done 40 years earlier. Though Richard won hopes with better results, Eleanor didn't try to stop him. She understood the pull of crusading glory, even if she also understood its ultimate futility. Instead, she focused on keeping his kingdom intact while he was gone. This meant managing John, her youngest son, the one Henry had called Lackland because there were no territories left for him. John had all of his father's cunning but none of his charisma. He schemed constantly, testing the boundaries of Eleanor's authority, probing for weakness. She handled him with a mixture of maternal affection and steel-cold pragmatism. She gave him enough power to keep him satisfied, but never enough to actually challenge Richard's throne. The relationship between Eleanor and John was complicated. He was her son, yes, but he was also Henry's son, and he'd inherited his father's casual relationship with loyalty. She loved him in her way, but she never trusted him, perhaps because she recognized too much of herself in his ambitious eyes. Then came the news that every medieval mother dreaded. Richard had been captured. On his way home from crusade, he'd been taken prisoner by Duke Leopold of Austria, who had a grudge about some unfortunate flag-related incident during the siege of Acre. Leopold sold Richard to Emperor Henry VI, who demanded a ransom that would bankrupt kingdoms. 150,000 marks, roughly twice England's annual revenue. Eleanor, now 70 years old, took charge of the situation with energy that would have exhausted people half her age. She personally oversaw the collection of the ransom, implementing taxes that made her deeply unpopular but were devastatingly effective. Every church gave up its silver. Every noble contributed. The poor gave what they could. Eleanor squeezed England like a sponge, extracting every possible penny. But collecting the money was only half the battle. She also had to prevent John from taking advantage of Richard's absence. Her youngest son had allied himself with Philip Augustus of France, the son of her first husband Louis, in one of history's more ironic twists. Together, they plotted to keep Richard imprisoned permanently. Eleanor outmaneuvered them both, using a combination of bribes, threats, and the kind of emotional manipulation only a mother can truly master. She personally traveled to Germany to deliver the ransom. Think about that for a moment. A 70-year-old woman, crossing the dangerous medieval landscape in winter, carrying a fortune in silver that every bandit in Europe knew about. She made the journey anyway, because she trusted no one else to ensure Richard's actual release. The emperor, faced with this formidable elderly woman who'd outlived husbands and empires, wisely took the money and let Richard go. The reunion between mother and son was, by all accounts, touching. Richard wept. Eleanor, characteristically, did not. She'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury queens couldn't afford. Instead, she immediately began planning how to rebuild Richard's authority and punish those who'd betrayed him during his captivity. But Richard, freed from prison, seemed determined to court death in other ways. He threw himself into warfare with renewed enthusiasm, besieging castles and fighting battles with the kind of reckless abandon that makes for excellent songs but terrible life expectancy. Eleanor watched, probably with resignation, as her favorite son seemed intent on squandering the kingdom she'd worked so hard to preserve. In 1199, her fears were realized. Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in Calais. The wound festered. Gangrene set in. Eleanor, receiving word at Fontevraud Abbey where she'd been staying, raced to his side. She arrived in time to hold him as he died, this golden son who'd inherited her courage but not, apparently, her survival instinct. At 77, Eleanor had outlived all but 2 of her 10 children. She'd buried 2 husbands and now her favorite son. Most women would have retreated into mourning. Eleanor had a kingdom to secure. John, despite everything, was now the last legitimate heir. She knew his flaws better than anyone, but she also knew that a bad king was better than a succession war. She personally escorted John to his coronation, her presence lending legitimacy to what everyone knew was a questionable succession. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, she didn't retire. Instead, she negotiated John's marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, traveled to Castile to fetch her granddaughter Blanche for marriage to the future Louis VIII of France, and continued managing the complex web of alliances that held the Angevin Empire together. Her last great act of queenship came in 1202 when she was besieged in Mirbeau by her own grandson, Arthur of Brittany, who disputed John's right to the throne. 80 years old, Eleanor held the castle against Arthur's forces, sending word to John for rescue. When John arrived and captured Arthur, who would later disappear under mysterious circumstances that everyone blamed on John, Eleanor finally allowed herself to rest. She retired to Fontevraud Abbey, not as a nun but as a royal patron who happened to live there. Even in retirement, she couldn't quite stop involving herself in politics. Letters seeking her advice arrived regularly. Kings and popes still valued her opinion. She'd become less a person than an institution, a living link to an age that was already passing into legend. Eleanor of Aquitaine died on April 1, 1204, at the age of 82. She'd lived through the Second Crusade, the rise and fall of the Angevin Empire, the reigns of 5 kings, and more scandals than the chroniclers could properly document. She was buried at Fontevraud, between Henry, the husband she'd rebelled against, and Richard, the son she'd loved above all others. Even in death, she positioned herself carefully. What makes Eleanor truly remarkable isn't just her longevity or her titles. It's how she repeatedly refused to accept the limitations placed on medieval women. Divorced when divorce was unthinkable. Remarried for love, or at least passion, when marriage was purely political. Led a rebellion when women were supposed to be obedient. Ruled kingdoms when women were supposed to be ornamental. She created the concept of courtly love, not because she was a romantic, but because she understood that giving women centrality in cultural narratives was a form of power. The songs the troubadours sang, placing ladies on pedestals and knights at their service, might seem quaint now. But in the 12th century they were quietly revolutionary. Every queen who came after her lived in her shadow. Every noble woman who dared to speak in council, who insisted on education for her daughters, who chose her own marriage path, owed a debt to Eleanor. She didn't break the glass ceiling that implies there was only one. She shattered dozens of them, leaving a path that others could follow. The chroniclers never quite knew what to make of her. Their accounts swing wildly between admiration and condemnation, often in the same sentence. The admirable but impious Eleanor, beautiful beyond measure but lacking in virtue, wise in counsel but dangerous in ambition. They couldn't reconcile the contradiction of a woman who was both powerful and female. Modern historians have similar problems. Was she a feminist icon or a privileged aristocrat playing games with kingdoms? A devoted mother or a manipulative matriarch who used her children as chess pieces? A woman seeking love and freedom or a power-hungry queen who happened to be female? The answer, of course, is yes. All of it. Eleanor was complicated in ways that make simple categorization impossible. She lived in an age when women had essentially three life paths: marriage, convent, or death. Eleanor created a fourth option: survival through sheer force of will. She outlived her enemies, outsmarted her husbands, and outmaneuvered entire kingdoms, not through military might or divine right, but through intelligence, patience, and an absolutely refuse-to-die attitude that carried her through 8 decades. Consider what she witnessed and survived. The transformation of Europe from a collection of warring duchies to nascent nation-states. The crusades that bled Europe white while accomplishing essentially nothing. The birth of Gothic architecture, courtly literature, and the university system. The rise and fall of dynasties. The evolution of law from might makes right to something approaching justice. She didn't just witness history, she shaped it. And perhaps most remarkably, she did it all while navigating the exhausting reality of constant pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing. 10 children over 15 years with Henry alone. Each pregnancy risking her life, each birth a dice roll with death. Yet she managed to govern kingdoms while pregnant, conduct diplomacy while nursing, and plan rebellions while raising princes. This was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Not a saint, certainly not a sinner by any reasonable measure, but something more interesting. A survivor. A woman who took every disadvantage of her gender and transformed them into unexpected advantages, who used the prison of marriage to acquire power, the burden of motherhood to build dynasties, and the assumption of female weakness to catch enemies off guard. When you think of medieval queens, perhaps you imagine passive figures in tall pointed hats, sitting quietly while history happens around them. Eleanor demolished that image. She was present at every major event of the 12th century, usually causing them. She turned queenship from a decorative position into an active force. So as we drift away from Eleanor's story, carried on the quiet current of time, consider how one woman's refusal to accept limitations changed the course of European history. How her rebellion against conventional roles created new possibilities for every woman who came after. How her story, told and retold through centuries, continues to challenge our assumptions about what was possible in the medieval world. Eleanor didn't just marry her way to 2 thrones. She transformed what it meant to be a queen. She proved that power wasn't just about armies and castles, but about intelligence, endurance, and the kind of patient planning that outlasts stone walls and iron swords. In a world that tried to silence women's voices, Eleanor spoke loud enough to echo through 8 centuries. As we leave Eleanor's world of rebellion and remarkable longevity, we descend into darker corridors of medieval power. where the crown's weight sometimes pressed queens into actions that chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record. These are the stories whispered in confessionals, written in cipher, and sometimes erased entirely from official histories. The line between political necessity and murder has always been remarkably thin in royal circles, but for queens, who couldn't lead armies or challenge rivals to single combat, sometimes the only weapon available was the one hidden in a ring, dissolved in wine, or wielded in the darkness of a nursery. These women didn't have the luxury of honorable warfare. They had only the tools available to those denied official power. Let us begin with Irene of Athens, a woman whose story reads like a Greek tragedy performed in Byzantine dress. Born around 752 into a noble family in Athens, she was selected as a bride for Leo IV precisely because she seemed harmless. Beautiful, certainly. Well-educated, of course. But from a family with no significant power base, no threatening alliances, the perfect ornamental wife for an emperor's son. How spectacularly wrong they were. Irene arrived in Constantinople in 769, a teenage girl entering the most sophisticated and dangerous court in the medieval world. The Byzantine Empire, that last remnant of Roman glory, operated on rules that made Western European politics look charmingly straightforward. Here, blinding was an act of mercy. It merely disqualified you from rule rather than killing you. Castration was a career move, and poison was practically a condiment. She spent her first years quietly observing, learning the intricate ceremonial dances of court life, understanding who truly held power versus who merely appeared to. Her husband Leo IV was competent but unremarkable, more interested in his religious controversies than his young wife. He was an iconoclast, believing religious images were idolatry. Irene, secretly, was an iconodule, venerating icons. Even her faith was an act of concealment. When Leo died suddenly in 780, and yes, there were whispers about the cause, though nothing was ever proven, their son Constantine VI was only 9 years old. Irene, at 28, became regent. The court expected her to be a placeholder, keeping the throne warm until Constantine came of age. They underestimated her rather dramatically. Her first years as regent were spent consolidating power with a subtlety that would have impressed Eleanor. She replaced military commanders with men loyal to her personally. She restored icon veneration, earning the devotion of the powerful church faction. She negotiated a favorable peace with the Arabs, something warrior emperors had failed to achieve, all while playing the role of devoted mother, preparing her son for his glorious future. But as Constantine approached his majority, a problem emerged. He actually expected to rule. At 16, he began demanding real authority, supported by army factions who found the idea of perpetual female regency embarrassing. Irene responded by doing what any loving mother would do. She arranged his marriage to Maria of Amnia, a woman specially chosen for her ability to make Constantine miserable. The marriage was a disaster, exactly as Irene intended. Maria was pious, severe, and about as romantic as a tax assessment. Constantine, young and passionate, found himself trapped in a relationship that made his daily life unbearable. His mother, meanwhile, sympathetically listened to his complaints while secretly encouraging Maria's worst tendencies. By 790, Constantine had enough. With army support, he declared himself sole emperor and confined Irene to house arrest. For a brief moment, it seemed the natural order had been restored. A male emperor on the throne, his mother properly relegated to spinning and prayer. But Irene hadn't survived 20 years in Byzantine politics to be defeated by her own son. she spent her confinement writing letters, hundreds of them, to bishops, to generals, to court officials, each one carefully crafted, playing on fears, ambitions, and grievances. Constantine, she suggested, was unstable. His military campaigns were failing. His divorce from Maria to marry his mistress Theodote was scandalous. Wasn't it unfortunate that such a promising young man had proven so disappointing? The fascinating thing about Irene's campaign against her son was its patience. She didn't hire assassins or attempt a coup. She simply let Constantine destroy himself while carefully documenting every failure. When he lost battles, her supporters made sure everyone knew. When he imposed new taxes, she expressed maternal concern about the burden on the people. She was gaslighting him on a civilization scale. By 797, Constantine's support had evaporated like morning mist. The army despised him, the church condemned him, the people mocked him. Irene graciously accepted their invitation to return to power. Constantine, perhaps still believing in maternal affection, didn't flee. He trusted that his mother would be merciful. On August 15, 797, while Constantine sat in the Purple Chamber, the very room where he'd been born, soldiers loyal to Irene entered. What happened next was done with Byzantine efficiency. They held him down and drove heated bronze needles into his eyes. The blinding was so thorough that chroniclers disagree on whether he survived. Some say he died immediately from shock. Others that he lived for years, a broken shadow hidden in monastery walls. Irene never acknowledged ordering the blinding. She was, after all, at morning prayers when it happened. How shocking, how devastating that her own soldiers would take such initiative. She wore mourning for precisely the appropriate amount of time, then had herself declared not Empress Regent, not Empress Mother, but Emperor. The masculine title. The first woman to rule the Roman Empire in her own right. She ruled for 5 more years, competently if not brilliantly. She lowered taxes, patronized monasteries, and tried to marry Charlemagne to reunite the Eastern and Western empires, a plan that failed when her courtiers, horrified at the idea of surrendering power to a barbarian, overthrew her. She died in exile on Lesbos, spinning thread as she'd been supposed to do all along. Was Irene a monster who destroyed her own son for power? Or a woman who recognized that in the Byzantine system there could only be one ruler, and maternal love was a luxury she couldn't afford? The Byzantine chroniclers themselves couldn't decide. They called her both saint and demon, often in the same text. Let us turn now to another accusation of maternal murder, though this one less certain. Joanna I of Naples, whose entire life was shaped by the violent death that occurred when she was barely 17. Born in 1326, Joanna inherited the kingdom of Naples at age 16, already married to her cousin Andrew of Hungary in a union designed to unite 2 branches of the Angevin dynasty. Andrew was difficult. Raised in Hungary, he arrived in Naples expecting to be king in more than just name. He spoke poor Italian, showed no interest in Neapolitan culture, and surrounded himself with Hungarian courtiers who treated the sophisticated Neapolitan court like conquered territory. He was also, by all accounts, personally unpleasant, crude, violent, and obsessed with establishing his masculine dominance over his wife's kingdom. Joanna, meanwhile, had been raised to rule. Educated in languages, law, and statecraft, she understood that Naples prospered through trade and diplomacy, not Hungarian-style military conquest. The marriage was a collision of incompatible worldviews, made worse by Andrew's repeated attempts to sideline his wife from her own government. On September 18, 1345, The young couple was staying at the Royal Hunting Lodge in Aversa. They'd been married 3 years, had a son, and by all appearances had achieved a frigid détente. That night, Andrew was called from his bedchamber by men he apparently knew. He walked out willingly. Minutes later, his screams echoed through the palace. The killers had thrown a rope around his neck and pushed him over a balcony. He dangled there, slowly strangling, while they held the rope from above. It was a particularly horrible way to die, even by medieval standards. When servants finally discovered the body, Joanna was found in her chambers, apparently shocked by the news. She'd been sleeping, she said. She'd heard nothing. The suspicion was immediate and overwhelming. How could the Queen not know about a murder happening literally outside her bedroom? The Hungarian court accused her directly. The Pope launched an investigation. The entire kingdom held its breath, waiting to see if their teenage queen would hang for regicide. But here's where the story becomes interesting. The actual evidence against Joanna was remarkably thin. Yes, she benefited from Andrew's death. Yes, she had motive. But the same could be said for dozens of Neapolitan nobles who despised the Hungarian influence. The men eventually executed for the crime were minor courtiers with their own grievances against Andrew. Joanna's defense was masterful. She presented herself as a grieving widow, wearing mourning for far longer than required. She cooperated fully with papal investigators, providing documents, testimony, and even submitting to interrogation. She also, very cleverly, immediately agreed to marry her dead husband's brother, Louis of Hungary, showing that she had no antipathy toward the Hungarian royal family. The Pope, after extensive investigation, declared her innocent. But the stain never quite washed out. For the rest of her long reign, she ruled for nearly 40 years. The whispers persisted. Had she ordered the murder? Had she merely known and done nothing? Or was she genuinely innocent, a convenient scapegoat for a crime committed by others? The truth, like so much in medieval history, remains shadowed. What we do know is that Joanna went on to rule Naples through plague, war, and 4 marriages with remarkable competence. She patronized arts and learning, reformed the legal system, and navigated the treacherous waters of Italian politics with skill that Eleanor would have admired. If she was a murderess, she was an exceptionally capable one. But perhaps the most chilling stories of royal murder come not from these grand political assassinations, but from the quiet deaths in royal nurseries, the infants who failed to thrive, the toddlers who suffered mysterious accidents, the older children who developed sudden illnesses just as they became threats to succession. Consider the case of Fredegund, Queen of the Franks in the 6th century. Her rise to power was built on a foundation of small corpses. A servant girl who caught King Chilperic's eye, she systematically eliminated obstacles to her advancement. First, Chilperic's wife Galswintha died under mysterious circumstances. Then, one by one, Chilperic's sons from his first marriage began to die. Theudebert died in battle, honorably enough, though Fredegund's enemies noted she'd encouraged his reckless military ambitions. Merivek committed suicide after being accused of treason, accusations that originated from Fredegund's whispers. Clovis was stabbed to death by assassins who were never caught, but who seemed remarkably well informed about his movements. With each death, Fredegund's own sons moved closer to inheriting the throne. She bore Chilperic 4 sons, 3 of whom died in a dysentery outbreak that, curiously, affected only the royal children and not their nurses or servants. Some historians suggest she sacrificed her own children to divert suspicion from the deaths of her stepsons. If true, it's a level of cold calculation that defies comprehension. The medieval world was certainly dangerous for children. Disease, accident, and violence claimed young lives with heartbreaking regularity. But royal children, with their armies of nurses, physicians, and guards, should have been safer than most. Yet they died at remarkable rates, especially when their deaths benefited ambitious queens. Agnes of Poitou, mother of Emperor Henry IV, was rumored to have poisoned her own brother-in-law to secure her son's inheritance. Constance of Sicily allegedly arranged accidents for her husband's illegitimate children who might challenge her own son's succession. Catherine de' Medici, though technically Renaissance rather than medieval, was accused of eliminating various young relatives who stood between her children and power. Most of these accusations remain unproven. Medieval medicine was primitive enough that many murders could easily masquerade as natural deaths. A fever that lasted too long. A fall from a horse that seemed unusually severe. Food poisoning that affected only one person at a well-attended feast. Without forensic science, without proper autopsies, suspicion was all that remained. But sometimes the evidence was harder to dismiss. Take the case of Isabella of France, the she-wolf, who deposed her husband Edward II of England. After Edward's forced abdication in 1327, he was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. The official story was that he died of natural causes. The unofficial story, whispered but never proven, involved a red-hot poker and an entrance that would leave no external marks. Isabella's involvement was never definitively established. She was miles away when Edward died, establishing an alibi that would satisfy any modern court. But Berkeley Castle was controlled by her supporters. The guards were her men, and Edward's death was remarkably convenient for her plans to rule through her young son. The methodology of these royal murders reveals something profound about the constraints placed on medieval queens. Unable to challenge rivals directly, they turned to indirect methods. Poison, because it could be administered by those who had intimate access to the victim's food and drink. Arranged accidents, because women's supposed weakness meant they couldn't be suspected of physical violence. Manipulation of others to commit the actual deed, maintaining plausible deniability. The poison of choice varied by era and availability. Hemlock and wolfsbane grew in any castle garden, ostensibly for medicinal purposes. Arsenic, when it became available, was popular for its subtlety. The symptoms mimicked so many common ailments. Mercury, despite its eventual effects being quite obvious, was used frequently, perhaps because it was also a legitimate medicine in small doses. Some queens became students of toxicology by necessity. They learned which substances left traces, which acted quickly versus slowly, which could be detected by taste or smell. They cultivated relationships with physicians who understood discretion, with merchants who didn't ask questions about unusual purchases, with servants whose loyalty could be bought or compelled. The kitchens of suspicious queens became fortresses of paranoia. Every ingredient tested, every dish watched from preparation to consumption. Food tasters weren't just checking for poison, they were potential witnesses who might need to be eliminated if they detected something. The simple act of eating became a complex ritual of survival. But beyond the practical mechanics of murder, these stories reveal the impossible positions medieval queens occupied. They were expected to be powerful enough to produce heirs and manage kingdoms, but submissive enough to never challenge male authority. They were required to be ruthless in protecting their children's inheritance, but maternal and gentle in their public persona. Some queens resolved this contradiction through careful compartmentalization. They attended Mass in the morning and planned assassinations in the afternoon. They embroidered altar cloths while contemplating which rival's child posed the greatest threat. They prayed for their enemies' souls while ensuring those souls would soon need prayers. The psychological toll must have been extraordinary. Imagine living every day knowing that you'd ordered the death of children, perhaps even your own. Imagine looking at your surviving offspring and calculating their value against their threat potential. Imagine confessing these sins to priests who were themselves potential threats, who might use your admissions as weapons. Some queens apparently felt no guilt at all. Brunhilde of Austrasia, who ruled the Frankish kingdoms in the late 6th century, orchestrated the deaths of 10 kings and princes with the emotional investment most people reserve for arranging furniture. When finally captured by her enemies at age 70, she faced her execution, being dragged to death by wild horses, with the same cold dignity she'd shown while ordering murders. Others were destroyed by their actions. Gunhild of Denmark, after allegedly poisoning her husband's mistress and the mistress's children, spent her final years seeing the victims in every shadow. She died raving about invisible accusers, blood that wouldn't wash from her hands. Whether this was genuine guilt or convenient madness to avoid responsibility, we'll never know. The question that haunts these stories is always the same. Were these women monsters, or were they simply playing by the only rules available to them? In a world where losing power meant death for themselves and their children, where mercy was seen as weakness, where male rivals could wage war but female ones could only whisper and poison, what choices did they really have? Consider Blanche of Bourbon, Queen of Castile, whose story inverts the usual narrative. She was the victim, not the perpetrator, of royal murder. Married to Peter the Cruel, a nickname he earned with enthusiasm, she was imprisoned almost immediately after their wedding. Peter preferred his mistress, Maria de Padilla, who may or may not have encouraged Blanche's imprisonment. For 8 years, Blanche languished in various castles while Maria bore Peter's children and acted as unofficial queen. Then, in 1361, Blanche died suddenly at age 25. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, everyone knew Peter had ordered her death. But here's the twist. Maria de Padilla had died months earlier. If she'd orchestrated Blanche's murder, she'd done it from beyond the grave. This highlights another aspect of queens and murder. Often they were blamed for deaths they had nothing to do with. A convenient scapegoat for actions actually ordered by kings who preferred to maintain their chivalrous reputations. After all, it was easier to blame a wicked queen than admit the divinely appointed king was a murderer. The accusations themselves became weapons. Once a queen was suspected of murder, the stain was permanent. Even if proven innocent, the whispers continued. "There's no smoke without fire," people said, ignoring that sometimes smoke was deliberately manufactured by political enemies. Take Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses. She was accused of murdering Henry VI's advisors, of poisoning rivals, of ordering battlefield executions. The evidence? She was French, she was intelligent, and she actually tried to rule while her mentally ill husband was incapacitated. The real murders happening all around her, ordered by male nobles, were conveniently overlooked. The double standard was breathtaking. Kings who murdered rivals were strong. Queens who did the same were unnatural. Kings who eliminated threats to succession were pragmatic. Queens who protected their children's inheritance were monsters. The same action that earned a king respect earned a queen eternal damnation. This brings us to the curious case of Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France, accused of murders she definitely didn't commit because she was too busy being accused of other crimes. adultery with her brother-in-law, selling France to England, witchcraft, and general debauchery kept her so occupied in the scandal sheets that she hardly had time for murder. Yet when her son, the Dauphin Charles, began eliminating rivals, guess who was blamed? Not Charles himself, oh no. It must have been his mother's influence, her Bavarian blood, her feminine corruption. The fact that Isabeau was actually trying to negotiate peace while Charles was ordering assassinations was irrelevant to the narrative. The role of poison in these accusations deserves special attention. Poison was considered a feminine weapon, cowardly and unnatural. Real men used swords. Women, those weak and treacherous creatures, used poison. This gendering of murder methods meant that any death by poison was automatically suspected to be a woman's work. Yet the historical record shows men poisoned rivals just as frequently. The difference was in the perception. When King John of England was suspected of murdering his nephew Arthur, it was assumed he'd had the boy strangled or stabbed. When queens were suspected of murder, poison was always the presumed method. The preparation of these poisons became almost ritualistic. Lucrezia Borgia, though again technically Renaissance, allegedly had a ring with a hidden compartment for poison powder. The acqua tofana, a popular poison among Italian nobility, was sold as a cosmetic, allowing women to purchase it without suspicion. Some queens were said to have poisoned their own lips, building immunity while making their kisses literally deadly. But let's return to our central question, the line between political necessity and cold-blooded ambition. For some queens, murder was defensive, a response to immediate threats. For others, it was offensive, eliminating potential future problems. The moral distinction might seem clear to us, but in the medieval world, waiting for a threat to fully materialize usually meant waiting too long. Melisende of Jerusalem, ruling in the 12th century Crusader states, faced this dilemma directly. Her husband Fulk of Anjou attempted to sideline her from power. She responded not with poison or assassination, but with civil war, dividing the kingdom until Fulk agreed to joint rule. When asked why she didn't simply eliminate him, she supposedly replied that obvious murder would have weakened the kingdom more than partition. This pragmatic calculation, not whether to commit murder but whether murder was the most effective solution, appears repeatedly in medieval queens' stories. They were executives making cost-benefit analyses where the costs were measured in souls and the benefits in kingdoms. The methods of murder also evolved with medieval technology and knowledge. Early medieval queens relied on crude poisons and obvious violence. By the High Middle Ages, the arsenal had become sophisticated. Poisoned gloves that killed through skin absorption, contaminated books whose pages delivered death to anyone who licked their finger while reading, perfumes that caused gradual organ failure. Some queens became inadvertent pioneers of medical knowledge through their murder attempts. They discovered drug interactions, noted individual variations in poison susceptibility, developed antidotes for their own protection. It's grimly ironic that some advances in medieval medicine came from queens trying to kill people rather than heal them. The confessional posed a particular problem for murderous queens. Catholic doctrine required confession for absolution, but confessing to murder might mean earthly punishment alongside spiritual forgiveness. Some queens reportedly maintained multiple confessors, parceling out different sins to different priests so no one person knew the full extent of their crimes. Others found creative theological workarounds. If they hadn't personally administered the poison, were they truly guilty? If they'd merely mentioned how unfortunate someone's continued existence was, and a loyal servant took initiative, was that really murder? The medieval church, financially dependent on royal patronage, often proved remarkably flexible in its interpretations. As we near the end of this dark journey through medieval murder, consider the ultimate irony. Many of the queens most firmly accused of murder left behind the strongest, most stable kingdoms. Irene of Athens's reign saw Byzantine cultural flowering. Fredegonde's son Clothar II united the Frankish kingdoms. Even the suspected murderesses often proved more capable rulers than their supposedly legitimate male counterparts. Perhaps this was because queens who survived long enough to be accused of murder had already proven their political acumen, or perhaps the skills required for successful assassination, patience, planning, attention to detail, ability to maintain facades, were the same skills needed for effective governance. The stories of these blood-stained crowns force us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, gender, and survival. Were these women aberrations, or were they logical products of a system that gave them responsibility without authority, expectation without respect? Did they choose violence, or did violence choose them? Modern historians increasingly lean toward systemic explanations rather than personal evil. These queens operated within structures that made murder a rational choice. When the alternatives were imprisonment, exile, or death, for themselves and their children, poison might have seemed like self-defense. But this systemic view shouldn't completely absolve individual responsibility. Some queens clearly exceeded even the loose moral boundaries of their time. The pleasure some seemed to take in their enemies' deaths, the unnecessary cruelty of certain murders, the elimination of children who posed no real threat. These suggest something beyond mere political calculation. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. These were complex women in impossible situations, making choices that ranged from understandable to unconscionable. They were products of their time who also shaped their time, victims of systemic violence who also perpetrated it. As we prepare to leave these stories of murder and ambition, one final consideration. The accusations themselves, regardless of truth, served a purpose. They reinforced the narrative that women with power were dangerous, unnatural, corrupting. Every queen accused of murder, guilty or innocent, became an argument against female rule. Yet these same stories, viewed from another angle, reveal women's remarkable resilience and resourcefulness. Denied legitimate channels of power, they created illegitimate ones. Forbidden from open warfare, they mastered covert operations. Excluded from formal politics, they became experts in the informal kind. The blood-stained crown wasn't just about murder. It was about the lengths to which women would go to claim and maintain power in a world designed to deny them both. Whether we see them as villains or victims, or more accurately, as both, these queens demand recognition for their refusal to accept powerlessness. So as we move away from these shadowed throne rooms and poisoned chalices, remember that history is written by survivors, and in the medieval world, sometimes survival required actions that shock our modern sensibilities. These queens chose to survive, whatever the cost, and their kingdoms, their dynasties, their legacies survived with them. And now we arrive at perhaps the most fascinating paradox of medieval queenship, the extraordinary mental gymnastics required to be both saint and sinner, often within the same hour. These women knelt in prayer at dawn while planning adultery for dusk. They commissioned magnificent cathedrals while authorizing torture in their dungeons. They wore hair shirts for penance while dressed in silk worth more than villages. The medieval world didn't just permit this duality, it required it. A queen who was only pious would be deemed weak, unable to protect her realm. A queen who was only ruthless would be condemned as unwomanly, unfit to rule. The successful queen learned to wear both faces so seamlessly that even she might forget which one was real. Consider the typical morning of a medieval queen. Before dawn, she rises for matins, the first prayer of the day. She kneels on cold stone, genuinely or performatively seeking divine guidance. Her lips form the Latin words she's known since childhood. Pater noster que es in caelus, Our Father who art in heaven. The same Father she'll invoke later when ordering troops to burn a rival's holdings. The chapel is freezing, breath mists in the air, fingers stiffen around prayer beads. Yet she remains perfectly still, perfectly devoted. The courtiers watching, and there are always courtiers watching, must see nothing but sincere faith. Even if her mind is calculating how much gold she can extract from the bishop in exchange for supporting his candidate for archbishop. After prayers comes the distribution of alms. The queen, dressed in modest wool despite owning wardrobes of silk, personally hands coins to the poor gathered at the castle gates. She touches diseased hands without flinching, speaks gently to lepers, blesses orphan children. The crowd sees a saint. They don't see her secretary noting which merchants donated to her charity, which ones didn't, and adjusting trade licenses accordingly. This public charity served multiple purposes. It fulfilled genuine Christian duty. Many queens did believe in their obligation to the poor. It generated goodwill among common people who might otherwise resent royal wealth. And it provided perfect cover for less charitable activities. Who could suspect a woman who spent her mornings feeding beggars of spending her afternoons planning economic warfare? Take Matilda of Flanders, wife of William the Conqueror. She founded multiple abbeys, personally tended sick nuns, and commissioned religious artworks of stunning beauty. She also ruthlessly administered William's kingdoms during his absences, ordering executions, confiscating lands, and allegedly having one of William's mistresses murdered and her body displayed as a warning. The abbey she founded at Cannes became her particular project. She visited regularly, bringing gifts and joining the nuns in prayer. She also used these visits to conduct secret negotiations with Norman nobles who wouldn't openly oppose William, but might be persuaded to support her son Robert's claim over William's preferred heir. The Holy Sisters, sworn to silence, provided perfect cover for conspiracy. This weaponization of religious patronage was an art form. Queens funded monasteries that became centers of their intelligence networks. Abbesses, often noblewomen themselves, understood the game. They provided sanctuary for the queen's allies, spread propaganda disguised as moral instruction, and sometimes harbored very unholy secrets. Margaret of Provence, Queen of France, maintained a particularly sophisticated system. She sponsored religious houses along major trade routes, creating a communication network that rivaled any modern intelligence agency. Messages could travel from Provence to Paris faster through her Holy Sisters than through official royal couriers. The fact that these messages were hidden in shipments of communion wine and altar cloths was merely practical. The confessional became another tool of duality. Queens maintained multiple confessors, one for genuine spiritual guidance, another for political absolution, sometimes a third for sins too dangerous to admit to anyone truly connected to the church hierarchy. They parsed their sins carefully, admitting to pride but not to the specific proud act of defying their husband, confessing anger but not the expression of that anger through ordered assassination. Some queens developed elaborate theological justifications for their dual nature. Berengaria of Navarre, Richard the Lionheart's neglected queen, reportedly argued that God had placed her in an impossible position, therefore God must understand her impossible choices. If he didn't want her to sin, he shouldn't have made her a queen. It was remarkably convenient logic. The performance of piety required constant vigilance. A queen had to know exactly how much religious devotion was expected, no more, no less. Too little, and she was ungodly. Too much, and she might be suspected of overcompensating for hidden sins. The balance was exhausting. Isabella of Angoulême, King John's widow, navigated this particularly well. After John's death, she maintained a public persona of grieving widowhood and religious devotion while secretly negotiating her own remarriage to her first love, Hugh de Lusignan. She attended 3 masses daily, very publicly, while her agents arranged the dissolution of Hugh's existing betrothal. When the marriage was announced, she claimed divine revelation had shown her this was God's will. Who could argue with God? The calendar of religious observances provided structure for this double life. During Lent, queens fasted ostentatiously while secretly maintaining strength through carefully hidden meals. They attended endless Easter services while their minds planned summer military campaigns. They celebrated saints' feast days while remembering which of those saints had been martyred for defying authority. Useful examples, properly interpreted. Christmas court was particularly rich in contrasts. Queens presided over magnificent celebrations of Christ's birth while engaging in decidedly unchristian political maneuvering. Under the cover of holiday festivities, alliances were formed, marriages arranged, and sometimes rivals were quietly eliminated. The 12 days of Christmas provided perfect cover. Everyone was drunk, distracted, and distances from home. The Virgin Mary became a particularly complex figure for medieval queens. They were expected to emulate her purity, her submission, her maternal devotion. Yet Mary had also been the Queen of Heaven, commanding angels, defeating Satan. Queens became expert at emphasizing whichever aspect of Mary suited their current needs. Gentle mother when seeking sympathy, warrior queen when justifying aggression. Some queens took this identification with Mary to extraordinary lengths. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, commissioned artworks depicting herself as the Virgin, her son as Christ. The theological implications were staggering, but the political message was clear. Opposing her was opposing divinity itself. The Church, financially dependent on royal patronage, found ways to tolerate this near blasphemy. Religious visions became particularly useful tools. Queens would announce divine revelations at remarkably convenient moments. God had told them to support this faction, oppose that marriage, invade this territory. These visions were unverifiable, but also unchallengeable. Who could prove God hadn't spoken to them? Hildegard of Bingen, though an abbess rather than a queen, provided the template. Her visions gave her authority to correspond with emperors, criticize popes, and influence politics across Europe. Queens noticed and adapted. Suddenly, divine revelations were everywhere. Elizabeth of Hungary took a different approach, embracing religious extremism as a form of rebellion. After her husband's death, she abandoned her children, gave away her wealth, and joined the most austere religious order she could find. This wasn't piety, it was a massive rejection of everything queenship required. Her extreme asceticism was, paradoxically, a form of self-assertion. The Crusades provided perfect opportunity for queens to blend piety and power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, as we've discussed, used the Second Crusade to escape her marriage. Other queens used their husbands' crusading absences to rule independently. They governed in the name of God and absent kings, a combination that made them nearly untouchable. Sibylla of Jerusalem presents a fascinating case study. queen of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, she had to balance Christian piety with the practical needs of ruling a kingdom surrounded by Muslim powers. She attended Mass each morning, then negotiated with Muslim merchants. She funded Christian pilgrims while maintaining diplomatic correspondence with Saladin. Her ability to separate religious performance from political reality kept Jerusalem stable for years. The financing of religious institutions reveals the calculated nature of royal piety. Queens didn't just donate randomly. Every gift was strategic. This abbey controlled important roads. That monastery produced educated clerks. This shrine attracted pilgrims whose spending enriched the royal treasury. Charity and calculation were inseparable. Some queens essentially purchased sanctity. Adelaide del Vasto, Countess of Sicily, donated so extensively to religious institutions that monks and priests across Europe sang her praises. Literally, they were contractually obligated to pray for her soul in perpetuity. She bought herself a reputation for holiness that obscured her very unholy political maneuvering. The building of religious monuments became competitive queenship. Each queen tried to outdo her predecessors and rivals in the magnificence of their foundations. Larger churches, more beautiful windows, more golden altarpieces. These projects employed thousands, stimulated economies, and created lasting propaganda for the queen's piety. The fact that they also provided excellent money laundering opportunities for funds of questionable origin was rarely mentioned. But perhaps nowhere was the saint-sinner duality more evident than in queens' treatment of their enemies. In the morning, they might publicly forgive a rival, embracing them in Christian charity before the court. By evening, that same rival might suffer a mysterious accident. The queen would then very publicly pay for masses for the departed soul, completing the cycle of hypocrisy. Agnes of Morania, briefly Queen of France before her marriage was annulled, mastered this performance. When Pope Innocent III excommunicated her husband Philip Augustus for their illegal marriage, Agnes publicly submitted to the Church's judgment. She retired to a convent, proclaimed her acceptance of God's will, and spent her days in prayer. She also spent them writing letters that kept Philip's passion alive and undermined his reconciliation with his first wife. She was simultaneously the perfect penitent and the perfect manipulator. The education of royal children revealed these contradictions starkly. Queens taught their daughters to be pious, submissive, and chaste while simultaneously instructing them in statecraft, manipulation, and survival. They raised sons to be Christian knights while ensuring they understood that Christianity was often negotiable when power was at stake. Adela of Normandy, mother of King Stephen of England, exemplified this dual education. She had her children instructed by monks in Christian virtue, while she herself taught them practical politics. Her son Stephen learned to hear Mass every morning and break sacred oaths every afternoon. The cognitive dissonance was built into royal education. The cult of courtly love added another layer to this complex performance. Queens were expected to inspire pure, spiritual devotion while maintaining absolute marital fidelity. They presided over courts where knights pledged passionate but chaste service to married ladies. Everyone understood this was elaborate theater, but the performance had to be maintained. Marie de Champagne, Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, turned this theater into high art. Her court of love debated whether true love could exist in marriage, whether lovers should reveal their feelings sometimes, and whether love or honor was more important. It depended. These were theoretical discussions of imaginary scenarios that everyone knew were actually practical guides to actual affairs. The Queen's patronage of literature reinforced these dualities. They commissioned religious texts and romantic poetry, saints' lives and secular romances, often from the same authors. A scribe might spend his morning copying prayers and his afternoon writing erotic verse, all for the same royal patron. The Virgin Mary appeared in these texts as both Holy Mother and courtly lady. Christ became both Savior and the ultimate knight-errant. The boundaries between sacred and secular blurred until they became meaningless. This wasn't accidental. It was carefully cultivated ambiguity that allowed queens to operate in both spheres simultaneously. Some queens seem to genuinely struggle with their dual nature. Constance of Castile, wife of Louis VII of France after Eleanor, spent her final years in increasingly desperate attempts to reconcile her political actions with her religious beliefs. She founded more monasteries, undertook more pilgrimages, wore more hair shirts. Nothing eased her conscience. She died muttering about sins that couldn't be absolved. Others appeared to feel no conflict at all. Judith of Bavaria cheerfully attended morning mass, ordered an execution at noon, and slept soundly each night. When asked about the contradiction, she supposedly replied that God had made her a queen. Therefore, everything she did as queen was God's will. The circular logic was impeccable. The use of relics revealed the intersection of faith and power particularly clearly. Queens collected supposed fragments of the true cross, saints' bones, and miraculous objects with the fervor of modern collectors. But these weren't just religious items, they were political tools. A queen who possessed Saint Denis's fingerbone could claim his protection. A rival who challenged her was challenging the saint himself. The trading of these relics became diplomatic currency. A queen might gift a holy relic to secure an alliance, loan sacred objects to demonstrate favor, or withhold them to show displeasure. The bones of saints became bargaining chips in very unsaintly negotiations. The Cathedral of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, built to house relics Louis IX acquired, cost more than multiple military campaigns, but it projected French power more effectively than any army. Margaret of Scotland, later canonized as a saint herself, presents a particularly interesting case. She was genuinely devout, spending hours in prayer, personally washing the feet of beggars, fasting until she fainted. Yet she also used her piety as a weapon against her husband Malcolm III's political enemies. Those who opposed her were opposing a living saint. How could they be anything but evil? Her daily routine embodied this duality perfectly. She rose at midnight for prayers, returned to bed, rose again at dawn for more prayers, then spent her morning in charitable works. But afternoon brought political councils where she advocated for wars against enemies she'd just finished praying for. She saw no contradiction. God's work required both prayer and pragmatism. The phenomenon of royal saints, queens who were actually canonized, reveals how successfully some women managed this balance. Saint Adelaide of Italy, Saint Cunegund of Luxembourg, Saint Elizabeth of Portugal. Each was recognized for extraordinary piety while having lived lives of extraordinary political complexity. The Church, in canonizing them, essentially endorsed their dual nature. But sainthood was usually posthumous. Living queens had to manage their reputations more carefully. They created what we might call spiritual alibis. While their agents performed necessary but unchristian acts, the queen herself was visibly elsewhere, at prayer, on pilgrimage, in religious retreat. Plausible deniability extended even to the divine. Philippa of Hainaut, Queen of England, perfected this technique. While her husband Edward III waged the 100 Years' War with remarkable brutality, Philippa was constantly on pilgrimage. She traveled from shrine to shrine, praying for peace, while her household administrators, acting on her very detailed instructions, managed the war effort. She was simultaneously the peace-seeking saint and the war-enabling queen. The deathbed presented the ultimate test of this duality. As queens lay dying, they had to perform final reconciliation between their two natures. Some, like Eleanor of Provence, spent their last days frantically endowing religious houses, as if divine favor could be purchased at the last minute. Others, like Isabella of France, maintained their dual performance to the end, confessing selected sins while taking others to the grave. The wills of medieval queens read like attempts to buy salvation. Massive bequests to churches, funds for thousands of masses, instructions for perpetual prayers. Margaret of Anjou's will included provision for 20,000 masses to be said for her soul. At approximately 15 minutes per mass, that's over 5,000 hours of prayer. Surely enough to outweigh even the gravest political sins. Some queens attempted to resolve their duality by literally splitting themselves. They maintained two separate households, one religious, one secular. They dressed as penitents in the morning and as royalty in the afternoon. They had religious advisors who knew nothing of their political activities and political advisors who were kept away from their spiritual lives. Isabeau of Bavaria took this to extremes, maintaining entirely separate courts. Her religious court at Vincennes was austere, dominated by prayer and fasting. Her secular court at the Hotel St. Paul was luxurious, featuring feasts and entertainments. Courtiers learned to transform themselves between venues, changing not just clothes but entire personalities. The sexual dimension of this duality was particularly complex. Queens were expected to be simultaneously virginal and fertile, chaste and available to their husbands, pure in thought but productive in childbirth. They had to perform desire without feeling it or feel it without showing it. The mental contortions required were extraordinary. Some queens resolved this by essentially scheduling their sexuality. They established holy days when marital relations were forbidden, which, given the medieval religious calendar, could account for over half the year. They used religious obligation to control their own bodies, turning piety into a form of contraception. Others separated their sexual and spiritual selves completely. They maintained lovers while maintaining religious devotion, seeing no contradiction as long as the two never intersected. The afternoon's adultery was separate from the morning's prayers. Different parts of the same person, neither canceling the other. The raising of illegitimate children by ostensibly pious queens created particularly interesting dynamics. These children, proof of sin, were often placed in religious institutions. The queen would then become patron of that institution, visiting regularly to perform charity while actually checking on her hidden offspring. Sin and sanctity intertwined in the most literal way possible. The management of succession revealed these contradictions starkly. Queens prayed publicly for God to bless them with sons while privately consulting astrologers, wise women, and occasionally poisoners to ensure the right children survived. They thanked God for healthy heirs while secretly celebrating the convenient deaths of potential rivals. The remarriage of widowed queens posed particular challenges. They were expected to mourn their deceased husbands with elaborate displays of grief, while simultaneously negotiating new marriages for political advantage. They wore black while their agents wore out horses carrying marriage proposals. They wept in public and planned in private. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, was mourned with unprecedented elaboration, the famous Eleanor crosses marking her funeral route. But even as Edward wept, he was negotiating his next marriage. The performance of grief was separate from the reality of politics. Everyone understood this, but the performance still had to be convincing. The patronage of art revealed these dualities in permanent form. Queens commissioned altarpieces depicting themselves as pious suppliants, while simultaneously commissioning portraits emphasizing their power and wealth. The same artist might paint the Queen as the Virgin Mary and as Venus, sometimes in the same week. Books of Hours, those personal prayer books owned by wealthy medieval women, often contained surprising juxtapositions. Sacred prayers alongside secular poetry, images of saints next to courtly lovers, devotional texts bound with romantic tales. These books, highly personal objects, reveal the integrated duality of their owners' lives. Christine de Pizan, writing at the medieval period's end, finally articulated what queens had been living for centuries. In her Book of the City of Ladies, she argued that women could be both virtuous and powerful, religious and political, gentle and strong. She was simply describing what successful queens had always known. Survival required being everything simultaneously. The Protestant Reformation would eventually challenge this comfortable duality, demanding more consistency between belief and behavior. But medieval Catholic queens operated in a more flexible theological environment. Sin could be confessed and absolved. Contradictions could be embraced as divine mystery. The same God who demanded piety also appointed queens to power. This flexibility wasn't weakness, it was sophisticated theological reasoning. If God was omnipotent and omniscient, then he knew queens would sin when he placed them on thrones. Therefore, their sins were part of his plan. Therefore, sin in service of divine appointment wasn't really sin. The logic was self-serving but internally consistent. Some queens even argued that their dual nature made them more Christian. Christ himself was both human and divine, both suffering servant and triumphant king. By embodying contradictions, queens were actually imitating Christ. It was audacious theology that would have been heretical from anyone without a crown. The most successful medieval queens were those who stopped seeing their dual nature as a problem to be solved and started seeing it as a tool to be wielded. They used piety to justify power and power to demonstrate piety. They turned contradiction into strength, hypocrisy into strategy. Consider Melisende of Jerusalem one final time. She ruled a crusader kingdom that was itself a contradiction, a Christian state maintained through violence in the name of the Prince of Peace. She attended Mass in churches built on conquered land, prayed for victory in unholy wars, showed Christian charity to Muslim subjects. She didn't resolve these contradictions. She embodied them. As we prepare to leave these medieval queens with their dual faces and divided souls, consider that perhaps they were simply more honest than we are about the contradictions inherent in power. They didn't pretend that authority could be exercised without compromise, that survival didn't sometimes require sacrifice of principle. Modern leaders maintain similar dualities, though perhaps less obviously. They speak of peace while preparing for war, champion democracy while making backroom deals, invoke moral authority while engaging in practical politics. The difference is that medieval queens did it all while wearing crowns and kneeling in prayer, making the contradictions visible, almost theatrical. These queens proved that human beings are capable of extraordinary compartmentalization, of being simultaneously saint and sinner not through hypocrisy, but through the complex reality of living in an imperfect world while striving for perfect ideals. They were both slash and rather than either slash, or multiple rather than singular. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about these medieval queens wasn't that they maintained such contradictions, but that they maintained them so successfully for so long. They built kingdoms on paradox, dynasties on duality. They proved that sometimes the most effective truth is the one that embraces contradiction. So as you drift toward sleep, perhaps in a bed more comfortable than any medieval queen ever knew, consider these women who rose before dawn to pray and stayed up past midnight to plot, who built churches and destroyed enemies, who embodied everything their world demanded women couldn't be. They were living contradictions, and in those contradictions they found a kind of freedom. The saints and sinners weren't different queens. They were the same women at different hours of the same day. And perhaps that's the most human truth of all. We are none of us purely one thing. We are all, in our own small ways, both saint and sinner, though hopefully with less poison and fewer political assassinations than our medieval predecessors. And so, our journey through the shadowed corridors and silk-draped chambers of medieval queenship draws to its close. We've walked alongside these remarkable women through their days of constant performance, witnessed Eleanor's magnificent defiance of every convention, descended into the darker necessities of political murder, and observed the exhausting duality of saints who sinned and sinners who prayed. What emerges from these stories isn't a simple narrative of victims or villains, but something far more complex and ultimately more human. These queens were women navigating an impossible maze where every path led through danger, where survival required skills that no one would teach them, where the crown they wore was both their greatest protection and their heaviest burden. Think for a moment about the sheer mental fortitude required to live as they did. To wake each morning knowing that your breakfast might be poisoned, your confessor might be a spy, your husband might be plotting your replacement, your children might grow up to be your enemies, and yet to rise anyway, to dress in those impossibly heavy gowns, to smile at court, to rule kingdoms. It's a kind of courage we can barely comprehend from our safe, modern distance. The medieval world asked these women to be impossible things, powerful but submissive, fertile but pure, intelligent but silent, ruthless but maternal. The fact that some of them managed to be all of these things simultaneously, or at least to perform them convincingly, speaks to a kind of genius that historians are only now beginning to properly acknowledge. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just outlive her enemies, she outlived entire worldviews. She persisted through changes that transformed Europe from a collection of warring duchies into something approaching modern nations. She adapted, evolved, survived. Not through luck, but through careful calculation and iron wool dressed in silk and courtesy. The queens who turned to poison and assassination weren't necessarily more evil than their sword-wielding husbands. They were simply working with the tools available to them. When you cannot lead armies or fight duels, when your power depends entirely on your ability to produce heirs and manage households, sometimes the mushroom soup becomes a weapon of war. It's not admirable, perhaps, but it's understandable. And those remarkable women who managed to be both saints and sinners, who founded hospitals in the morning and ordered executions in the afternoon, they understood something profound about human nature, that we are all capable of containing contradictions, that purity is a luxury most people can't afford, that sometimes survival requires us to be multiple people simultaneously. What strikes me most about these stories is how modern these medieval women seem in their struggles. They dealt with workplace harassment, though their workplace happened to be a throne room. They balanced career and family, though their career was queenship and their family disputes might trigger civil wars. They fought for respect in male-dominated environments, though their environment included knights and crusades rather than boardrooms and conferences. The tools have changed. We have human resources departments instead of poison rings, divorce lawyers instead of papal annulments, social media instead of troubadours spreading propaganda. But the fundamental challenges of women navigating power structures designed to exclude them, those remain remarkably familiar. Consider how these queens would view our modern world. Eleanor might be amused that it took another 8 centuries for women to regularly lead nations. The Poisoner queens might be impressed by our forensic science but disappointed by the lack of creative solutions to political problems. Those who balance sanctity and sin might wonder why we've made everything so complicated when a simple confession used to solve everything. They'd probably find our scandals quaint. A politician's affair makes headlines? Medieval queens managed multiple lovers while pregnant with their husbands' heirs. A leader is accused of financial corruption? Medieval queens funded entire wars through creative accounting that would make modern embezzlers weep with envy. Someone tweets something controversial? Medieval queens literally had people's tongues cut out for saying the wrong thing. Yet for all their power, for all their schemes and victories, these queens were ultimately trapped by their time. They could rule kingdoms but couldn't change the fundamental structures that constrained them. They could break individual rules but not the system that created those rules. They were revolutionaries who had to pretend to be traditionalists. Perhaps that's why their stories resonate even now, even in this quiet moment as you lie in your modern bed with your modern freedoms. These women remind us that progress isn't inevitable, that rights won can be lost, that every generation must fight its own battles against those who would prefer women to be decorative rather than decisive. But they also remind us of human resilience, of the extraordinary ability to adapt, survive, and occasionally triumph against impossible odds. Every one of these queens faced moments when surrender would have been easier, when accepting powerlessness would have been safer, when silence would have been smarter. They chose otherwise, and in choosing otherwise they left us these stories. Not fairy tales of princesses rescued by princes, but complex narratives of women who rescued themselves, who wrote their own stories even when forbidden to hold the pen, who spoke even when told to be silent, who ruled even when told to submit. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps feeling grateful for your modern bed without hidden passages, your food without poison testers, your life without constant mortal danger, remember that comfort is relatively recent. For most of human history, life was far more precarious, particularly for women who dared to want more than what they were given. These medieval queens paid prices we can barely imagine for freedoms we take for granted. They were imperfect, certainly, sometimes cruel, occasionally monstrous, but they were also brave in ways we rarely need to be. They walked through fire so their daughters could walk on cooler ground. The silk chambers we visited tonight weren't just rooms but fortresses. The secret letters weren't just correspondence but weapons. The daily routines weren't just schedules but survival strategies. Every element of these queens' lives was both exactly what it seemed and something entirely different, rather like the queens themselves. So let their stories settle into your drowsing mind like sediment in still water. These tales of women who refused to be merely decorative, who insisted on being historical actors rather than historical victims, who carved their names into the stone of time with whatever tools they could grasp. Tomorrow you'll wake to a world where women can rule without apology, where power doesn't require poison, where queens don't need to be saints to be legitimate. That world exists, in part, because medieval queens proved women were capable of wielding power, even when that proof came at terrible cost. But tonight just rest. Let your modern worries fade like morning mist. Your bed is safe from assassins. Your breakfast will be unpoisoned. Your confessions, should you make them, won't be used against you in courts of law. You have freedoms Eleanor could only dream of, safety the poisoner queens would have traded kingdoms for, opportunities those saint-sinner queens couldn't have imagined. The medieval world, with all its dangers and contradictions, its silk hiding steel, its prayers hiding plots, that world is gone. It exists now only in stories like these, told in quiet voices to drowsing audiences. Stories that remind us how far we've come and how carefully we must guard what we've gained. Sleep well, friend. Dream perhaps of stone castles and silk gowns, of powerful women and impossible choices, of a time when wearing a crown meant wearing a target, when every dawn might be your last, when queens were both more and less than human. And when you wake, remember, somewhere in the distance of centuries, a medieval queen is watching, probably wondering why you're worried about your small modern problems when you have central heating, antibiotics, and the right to own property. She'd trade her crown for your freedom in a heartbeat, though she'd probably keep the jewels. Some things, after all, are timeless. Rest now. The queens have told their stories. History has been remembered. And tomorrow's dawn will come, as it always does, without the need for poison testers or coded embroidery. Just another day in a world these medieval queens helped, in their complex and contradictory ways, to create. Good night.